walking on the wall. All these records were confiscated by the police for investigation, but were never returned. And soon my husband and grandmother moved from there. And knowing how much I love reading scary stories on the website Realfer, my husband suggested that I write this tragic story in memory of the life and death of an incomprehensible and talented and fortunate creature, unaccepted and misunderstood by people. It was a long time ago, when I was not yet alive in 1977, in the Azerbaijani city of Ganja. My husband, who was only 10 years old at that time immemorial, lived there with his grandmother in a 5-story building on the 5th floor, and in the next apartment lived a family, mother, father, daughter, and son of about 30, about whom, in fact, the story will be told. One day, the parents of this dumb man came to my husband's grandmother and asked her for help, and the grandmother was a knowledgeable woman. She treated people with prayers, bewitched, turned away. In general, she was a local healer, till the neighbors told her that something bad had happened to their son, and he was walking in his sleep at night, and he doesn't just walk, but climbs out the window and goes down perpendicular to the wall, completely breaking all the laws of gravity, descends to the ground and goes to the local park, located about 600 meters from the house. This park had a beautiful 2-story cafe built from champagne bottles. The sleeping guy somehow opened the door without a key, went into this cafe, and sat there for 2 to 3 hours, until the morning. Then, in the morning, he returned home, and along the way he did the same thing. He climbed the wall, breaking the laws of gravity and scaring to death the neighbors, who especially went out into the street to look at this miracle. But they were afraid to come close. Times were dark then. People were superstitious, and the guy calmly climbed up the wall, climbed into the window on the 5th floor, and went to bed. Waking up in the morning, he said that he talked with unusual people and was in incredible worlds and other dimensions. This movement continued for 6 months. If I didn't know my husband so well that he's not inclined to make things up, I would never have believed such a thing. But he saw it 3 times with his own eyes, and all the neighbors also came out of curiosity to look at this unforgettable sight. My husband's grandmother could not help the poor guy, as he was possessed by a very strong entity. He himself realized this and said that no one could do anything about it. By the way, the possessed young man was incredibly smart and inventive, but he didn't pay any attention to his appearance. He dressed sloppily and looked unkempt, which disgusted those around him. The unfortunate guy was constantly haunted by ridicule and bullying. Since childhood, he was offended, teased, and at school he had to endure a lot of torment from his peers. And although he was incredibly smart, his appearance said otherwise. When looking at this man, the thought arose that he was mentally retarded. According to my husband's recollections, the guy was closed and unsociable, and was never the first to speak to anyone. And if they asked him about something, he answered the question in monosyllables and immediately ran away. He was a calm and non-aggressive person, but people teased him and called him a fool. By the way, people in those days, in that place, were cruel and merciless, and even offended each other, let alone an individual so different from them. The times were ancient. There was not even a color TV there yet, but our hero made it himself, to the envy of all his neighbors. The cars back then were also antediluvian. A Moskvich that had been involved in an accident and was almost completely wrecked stood outside the house for a long time. The front doors opened to another set of sounds, and the rear doors to the third. Who in those days could have known about voice control? But he apparently knew, and the car started on a certain voice command. Our hero installed some other gadgets that were invented only 50 years later. My husband saw all this with his own eyes. Well, of course, after all this the guy was feared and hated. Life was very difficult for him. His development was far ahead of his time, and this aroused hostility and hatred on the part of the father, who beat his son mercilessly, called him a freak, and mocked him as best he could. His father never bought him anything. Neighbors gave him things and clothes, and our hero looked very unpresentable, a plump, average height guy, dressed poorly and, in addition, looked like an idiot. All the bullying of his own father and strangers were described in detail in the young man's diaries, which were found after his death. One day, during his son's next sleepwalk, a father placed a wet rag on his bed. The guy stepped on it because he was walking barefoot, woke up abruptly, and went crazy from such a shock. And after a little time, the unfortunate man shot himself in the head with a double-barreled shotgun. He was found on the floor near the wall, next to a hunting rifle, which he had leaned against the wall with the butt of, pointed the barrels at his throat, and pulled the trigger with his foot. Half of his head was blown off by the doublet. To say that everyone was horrified is to say nothing. The police had suspicions that this was a murder set up to look like suicide. After all, many hated the guy, including his own father, but all doubts were dispelled after reading the diaries of the poor young man. The diaries were found in the deceased's room, and my husband read them too. It was written about the experiences and sufferings of that unfortunate man, that he could no longer live among such people. He was considered a fool, and he was offended by everyone for it. He wrote that he could respond to people's aggression in such a way that they could not stand it. He did not want to harm anyone and therefore ran away from people. And, possessing incredible strength, he did not use it. His highly spiritual development did not allow him to return evil for evil. The young man also wrote in detail about his own father's hatred of him, who wanted to make a man out of him, wanted him to learn to fight and not engage in all sorts of nonsense. The guy poured out all his bitterness and resentment on paper, writing that only one sister understands and loves him, and no one else needs him like that. His mother was suppressed by a despot father, and it did not allow her to express her feelings and take care of her son. In general, the guy was a calm, quiet, and unsociable person, a little out of this world, not like everyone else, and because of this, society beat him to death. And the father wanted his son to be normal, not to have his head in the clouds, and not to be a weakling, and it was. Also in his diaries, the guy described his other incarnations in other worlds. There were many interesting and incredible entries, incomprehensible and beyond human understanding.